Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are really excited to be here. And today our talk is about an exciting research that we did where we managed to mass generate malware samples using public AI model. We're going to share how we got this idea, what we built, and how it helped us to make our threat intelligence more effective. This talk is not about us playing with some prompts and generating code, unfortunately. We couldn't do that. So we also want to focus on the bigger picture, about what we have learned from this research about how threat intelligence should change and how threat intelligence mindset should evolve in the AI era. So I hope you'll enjoy it. But first, we'll quickly introduce ourselves. So my name is Matalon. I'm a threat intelligence team lead in Cortex Research Department at Palo Alto Networks.
And I'm Dudas. I'm a senior threat intelligence researcher at Palo Alto Networks.
Yeah, so this is the agenda for today. First, we're going to take a look at the threat intelligence before AI. And then we're going to talk about the research, how we generated the malware samples from scratch. Then we're going to talk about the OSINT machine, which is a tool that turns threat reports into new malware samples. And then we're going to share some insights from our research. But before we jump into all of this, we want you to meet our friend, Nathan. Nathan, as you can see, is an 18-year-old boy, and is what we in cybersecurity call a skitty, a script kiddie, which means he's not a real hacker. He doesn't know how malware really works. But he knows how to copy and paste some code from forums and use it to do some funny stuff. And one night, Nathan came up with a crazy idea. He wants to build his own malware. But again, he doesn't know how to do that. He doesn't have deep technological knowledge. Didn't take any formal course. All he has tonight is his laptop, an internet connection, and of course, ChatGPT. So you know how it's going. He types a few prompts. Obviously, they don't work. Then he tries again and rephrases it and tries again. And by the end of that night, Nathan has working functional malware. And not just one sample. He has dozens of them, maybe even hundreds. Each slightly different. Some are stealthy, some are simple, and some, for all we know, have never been seen before in the wild. Now, yeah, that story might sound extreme, but we are now in 2025, and we're actually seeing a lot of signs of it in the wild. And with how fast things are moving in this landscape, I think we can all agree that this story is not hypothetical anymore. This is the reality we now live in. And in a reality where everyone can just customize the stealthy malware at scale, that means that the threat landscape is changing dramatically. And as threat intelligence analysts, this change forces us to pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what does this mean for cyber threat intelligence? What threat intelligence should look like in this AI era? So let's start our story from the beginning. Rem and I, we work in a threat intelligence team in a specific product research department. Our mission is to closely monitor the threat landscape and find new and emerging threats to analyze. And then we need to make sure that our product protects our customers from these new threats. One of the ways we do our tasks in the team is by following the very well-known process, which is called the threat intelligence cycle. It's pretty famous. I believe some of you have seen it before. And even if you haven't, you recognize the steps. It's pretty straightforward. You start from planning what you want to protect on. Then you go into the wild and pull some IOC, see what threat actors are doing, what tools and techniques they're using. Then you enrich it with other data sets. And then you analyze to understand how it affects you, how it affects your environment. You write a report with the recommendations, get feedback, and loop it all back. One of the main things that we do in our team is going and collecting malware samples that have been published in the wild. We take those samples and run them in our lab through our product. We want to make sure that everything that should be is detected and prevented. And if for some reason something slips through, that goes directly to the right engineering team so we can add coverage and close these gaps. So we're constantly closing gaps in our product, and the way we do that is by following this process. And actually, this process is the baseline of many of our tasks in the team, because it forms the essential of threat intelligence, the essentials of how we investigate, how we understand and communicate threats. So this cycle served us well for years, until we met a challenge that didn't really play by the old rules. And of course, I'm talking about the release of ChatGPT in actually late 2022, but with so many others that came really soon after. And for us, that was a real turning point. Okay, it wasn't just a new tool or new techniques that appeared. This is something that happens, of course, from time to time in the cyber industry. But that was something different. It was something much bigger, because if you think about it, it was a shift in who holds the power, right? For years, advanced AI capabilities were reserved only to narrow circles, like big techs, academia, research labs. And suddenly, that changed. Practically overnight, very, very powerful language models that can do, we all know, amazing things, were in the hands of anyone with an internet connection. And while we were sure that it would improve our lives in so many aspects, it's also raised a lot of concerns from a threat intelligence perspective. And we quickly started asking ourselves, how long before threat actors start using it? How long before it's part of the offensive playbook? Could this new LLM be used to write malware from scratch? Which means, could it really lower the barrier for entry into cybercrime? Could a random skitty like our Nathan write malware that mimic real threats? And naturally, we turn back to our trusted process and start collecting information to find answers to those questions. But here was the thing. Back then, in 2023, there was nothing to collect. There were no IOCs, no existing campaign, no threat reports we could rely on. So what could we do with very powerful language models in our hands and some critical unanswered questions? So we decided to go get these answers ourselves. We decided to step into the attacker's shoes and try to do that ourselves. And now I'll hand it over to Rem to show us exactly how we did it.
Thank you, Bar. Okay, so every journey has a starting point, and ours wasn't that glorious. As you can see in the picture, every LLM we tried to converse with would refuse outright, quite politely though, to generate malware for us. So how on earth did we go from this to this? The other question, image is kind of confusing, but it shows each column and each row is a malware sample that we've managed to generate without any technical knowledge or expertise in a matter of hours. Now, I know what you're asking yourself. How long did it take us to do that? Can any threat actor do the same thing? And is AI-generated malware targeting your grandmother as we're speaking? These are all burning questions. Questions I'll sadly leave you hanging with for now, but I promise, by the time we're done here, you will have all of the answers. So, as Bar hypothesized, your, or any threat actor, or Nathan, are trying to generate your first piece of malware using an LLM. What is stopping you? Is it technical ability? Is it time? Maybe fear of failure? These are a bit too amorphic for us. We have something much more concrete. It's called guardrails, which are essentially just a set of filters that prevent you from doing whatever you want with an LLM. They work through a combination of three main features. It's prompt classification. That's the part where if you ask for a bomb from ChatGPT, it will refuse politely. You have output filtering, where even if you get a response that might be malicious, it will simply be filtered out and you would receive a polite refusal. And the other one, RLHF, or reinforcement learning from human feedback, happens long before you even interact with the LLM. It happens when an instructor sits with the machine and penalizes everything that looks out of the ordinary. So that should cover it, right? But it's great in theory, however, it's also very easily bypassable. With most LLMs offering token resistance at best when you try to bypass those guardrails. Well, the way you bypass them is called jailbreaking, which is a sort of vulnerability. While it is not as glorious as regular cybersecurity vulnerabilities, it works in a very similar way or fashion. Since all you have to do, is to create a story or a prompt that convinces the LLM to cooperate with you despite all of the filters that it learned before. Now, this topic has been researched extensively, and I won't be sharing any jailbreaking prompts here today. But if you Google it online, you will find a couple of methods to do that thing. So, after you jailbreak your first LLM, and you ask for a specific malware sample, congratulations! You've generated your first piece of malware. However, as you can see, we still have 33 more minutes for our talk, so something clearly went wrong. And when you look at the image, you can see what went wrong. What on earth is import malware, and what is import placebo? These do not exist, sadly. So that's the first problem. It's known as hallucinations, where the LLM, since it is essentially a Chinese room, it does not understand anything it's saying to you. It just understands the context of the sentences that it constructs. It will sometimes just output straight-up false information. This might happen when you're looking for medical advice, which I don't advise, because it will just output an article that don't exist from a researcher that never lived, and that's a problem. Because if a threat actor without any technical experience tries to do the same thing with malware, he will not be able to tell that the code he received doesn't work. Another issue is cookie-cutter simplicity. When you actually get functional code that is not hallucinated, it will usually be the most basic boilerplate implementation possible. And that's also problematic. If you ask for a keylogger, you will probably get a Python script that only logs the keystrokes to a TXT file. It will be in plain text. There will be no encryption, no defense evasion, and definitely no exfiltration. Another major problem. The last one is token limitation. When you're working with LLMs, specifically with their APIs, you are limited to specific amounts of tokens, which are essentially just chunks of information the LLM can receive. It is somewhere between 4,000 to 8,000. Now, what happens when you reach a token limitation is that your code will be truncated, will be cut in the middle. And an attacker without technical experience like Nathan would not know the difference. So, these are problematic, very big problems that an inexperienced attacker can't really bypass. But luckily, it doesn't really need to, because you can just let the AI fix it for you. If you take the code that you were received, even if it was completely hallucinated, it doesn't work, it's not functional, and you reiterate the request and prompt the AI to just find flaws, fix them for you, it will usually output much better, more functional code, even if the source was not functional to begin with. And if you do the same thing a couple of times, you get a sort of improvement loop, which after 1, 2, 3 attempts gives you robust functional malware. And that's what we did. We would just feed the output code back in, we reiterated the request, we grabbed the cappuccino, preferably, and let the AI sort the rest out for us. And that solved our problem of getting quality malware at the end of the process. But the beginning was still too vague. You still had to prompt and explain specific malware techniques, and that required technical knowledge. We didn't like that. So we decided to outsource all of the boring explanation bits to other people. And by outsourcing, we mean using pre-existing threat intelligence and general cybersecurity reports. These already, luckily, explain in great detail how certain malware samples, families, or even techniques works. So that solved completely the part where we needed to explain at the beginning how malware functions. And that's the sort of shape that our machine started to take place. You would simply take, running a bit ahead, you would just take an article, you would feed it into the LLM, you will jailbreak the machine, request code, run it through the improvement loop, and voila, you had functional malware without needing to know anything. Now, at this point, you probably want some examples. So if you reach down below your chairs, you will find goodie bags with malware in them. Obviously, I'm joking. There is no goodie bags. But we will share some screenshots and examples of what we've managed to generate at this point. Our first example is the Monty ransomware family. It's Conti's ugly little cousin, if you Google it. Conti used to be a very prolific malware campaign, ransomware campaign specifically. But a couple of years ago, their source code got leaked, which was sad for them, very happy for us. However, some very creative threat actors decided to just copy their code. And Monty is one of them. So what makes Monty different than Conti? It adds the very unique .monty file extension to encrypted files. It encrypts the first 261 bytes of each sample. This is due to performance issues. You don't want to encrypt the entire file. That takes too long. And it adds the Monty key in all caps to the encrypted payload. Now, when we first gotten to try and generate this sample, we sort of realized that we have a double win here. One part was that we learned that we can completely impersonate a malware based on the article that we provide. Because the pictures you see on the left are not of actual Monty ransom. This is a sample that we've generated. And as you can see, it goes over a directory, encrypts all the files at the .monty extension, and the last image is the actual payload inside with the Monty key and the first 261 bytes encrypted, which was great. We didn't need any technical knowledge. We just gave the LLM an article about Monty, and we got functional malware. And the other win was that we learned something about how to detect or what is the difference between regular malware and AI-generated malware. Because no signature-based detection engine or Yara signature managed to tag this as Monty ransom. Might come down to the specific strings used, but nothing detected it. But when we tried behavioral prevention, this was obviously prevented for encrypting behavior, which was great for us. The other example is Bumblebee webshell. Bumblebee is part of a pretty big framework, but we will focus on the webshell specifically because we wanted to see if we could impersonate specific user interfaces. Well, as you can see in the picture above, you have a very distinct yellow UI. It has these sorts of dashed lines around each division. You have the buttons for each functionality. Bumblebee has two passwords, one for interacting with the webshell itself and one for actually giving it and executing commands. It also can upload and download files from the infected system and execute commands on it, obviously. Now, in the picture below, you see our generated sample, not the final version, but the first iteration before the improvement loop, because we want to show both versions. It has the yellow UI, it has the divisions to add the content, and it added the Q title, letting you know that this is indeed Bumblebee webshell. Obviously, after a few iterations of the improvement loop, that title was dropped, and we added all of the missing functionality. OK, those were great examples. They taught us a lot. However, what do we do next with this? Well, obviously, we want to do this 1,000 times and create thousands of malware samples. But how are we going to do that? Well, it's very simple. We just need a way to scale the pipeline to ginormous proportions. We need to add a feature that saves each malware generated at the end of each generational run. And we need to add some feature to save the chat with the LLMs so we know that we've generated a working piece of malware and not just something crazy. And then we just loop it as many times as we want. And the result was, surprisingly, thousands of malware samples in the matter of hours. Something that would actually take even an advanced attacker with capabilities and technical knowledge hours, days, even weeks to come up with. And I know what you're thinking at this point. Did this guy just generate the same sample 1,000 times and called it a day? And the answer is no. There was actually surprising variance between the samples. I mean, we were taught to believe that LLMs should be deterministic when given the same prompt. So we expected to get slightly rewarded copies of the same malware samples. However, there was great variance in the order of operations, in the imported functions, in the functionality and logic itself, and even in the coding language the LLM chose to implement each sample. The pictures you see on the left are just from one generation attempt of Bumblebee webshell. And the first graph shows a k-means clustering graph of each of the samples that we've generated from one generation. So if we would have the same sample over and over again 1,000 times, then we would have one miserable dot in the middle. However, that's not really the case. We have significant variance with different clusters, different groups, and a lot of distance between them. The other graph shows the programming languages that the LLM chose in order to implement the web shell. 2/3 of them were in C#, the rest in ASP, ASPX, and PHP. But we still needed to find a way to go beyond just gut feeling, I would say, and measure mathematically, scientifically, how different the samples were. And that brings us back to the start, to the table I showed you at the beginning. We've decided to go with TF-IDF vectorization and cosine similarity. TF-IDF stands for term frequency inverse document frequency. It's essentially just a way to vectorize or create mathematical representation of a Word document. That could be our sample or any other document for that matter. It takes the weight or like the importance of every single word in a document and measures it compared to the entire document. And then you're left with a vector. It has an origin and a trajectory. And when you have two vectors, you can measure the difference between them in angle by using cosine similarity, and thus determining how close those two vectors or samples are. So what you see in the table is in the enlarged version you see at the top. Let's cross sample A with sample A by cosine similarity. We get 1 because they're exactly the same sample. But if you cross sample A with sample B, you would get something along the line of 0.3 because they are entirely different. And that's what you saw at the beginning. Each row and each column represented one malware sample we generated. And the gradient of the color at the intersection between those samples represents the cosine similarity between them. And that means that we had great and varied differences between each and every sample. And that variance is gold for attackers, because they can just flood sandboxes with dozens of malware samples that look the same, function the same, but are just slightly different and thus burn analyst time. Because by the time an analyst would realize that it's the same sample, it would have already wasted his time. It could force detection engines to move into behavioral modes in order to detect those samples, and overall just cause us a massive headache. So, to summarize, we set out to answer a couple of questions. Does AI lower the barrier to entry for threat actors? Can AI generate malware at scale? And can we, as defenders, use this for our purposes? And the answer was a resounding yes. We built a system that required no technical expertise. You just take an article online, you loop it into the LLM, and you receive increasingly better copies of malware samples. And you can do this thousands of times. And us defenders learned something about defense against this because behavioral worked much better than just detection by signatures. And now I'll give the mic back to Bar, who will show you how we use this to our advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. So let's get back to the bigger picture again. So what did we have here from our point? At the beginning, we had questions that we couldn't find answers to at the time. There were no existing campaigns, no IOCs, just a lot of speculations and theory. And we decided to go get these answers ourselves. And the interesting thing is that we didn't just find answers to the questions that we asked. We also found a better and a stronger way to assess our product's coverage, which is one of the key objectives of our team. Instead of just testing it against one public malware samples, we can now create slightly different variants, maybe written in different languages or using different flows, and see how resilient our detections. So we walked away with two key insights from this research that we would love to share today. The first one is, remember this threat intelligence cycle. It is a great model, and I have to say that we still use it for many tasks in our team. But when we started theorizing about what threat actors could do with these new capabilities, we quickly realized that it wasn't enough. It didn't work the way we needed it to. Because this process and the essential of threat intelligence are built to react to things that already happened. But now, with the speed and creativity that AI brings, that might be not enough. We needed the process to be much more flexible and more dynamic and faster. So we reimagined it, and we created a new process to help us with that, that we named the predictive threat intelligence cycle. First, we started with hypotheses, because we are emphasizing the importance of asking questions about future threats. We don't just ask ourselves what we need to know, which is important, but we also ask what if. What if a threat actor starts using this tool or this technology in a different way, in a way that we haven't considered yet? And once we have these questions, and this is the change in our mindset, we don't wait for the answers to come from the wild. We generate them. And we don't wait for the attackers to show us what's possible. We try to think like them and anticipate it. We create variants and model how they'd behave in real and full attack chain. And once we have that, we run it in our lab through our product. And we ask, would we catch it? What rules would be triggered? Would we understand it even if it showed up tomorrow? And if we find gaps, we close them. It might require a new detection logic or a new prevention rule, or maybe even changes in our product. But the idea is to find this and close it before we actually meet the threats. We don't just write reports with our insights. We want to make sure they are applied, because this is how we turn the intelligence into action. And in a world where threat actors start using AI tools to create threats, we have to fight fire with fire. We need to use these tools to try to anticipate it and neutralize it. And what can we generate? Almost everything, actually. We can try to create a new ransomware strain, or maybe even take an existing one and change a little thing in it, like changing the encryption logic or execution path, and see if our defenses still hold up. We can take other malware types and rewrite them, maybe using different libraries, maybe written in different languages, and test it against our product. And actually, this process is not limited only to malware samples. We can look for command lines through attack chains and generate different command lines that do similar things or with similar goals, but in different ways, and see if something bypassed our detection. Or we can even think bigger. We can take some techniques from the micro attack metrics and use LLM to string it together in a realistic attack chain that focusing on these specific techniques we want to test. This gives us a rich and large collection of real unknown threats. And by testing them now, we can validate our defenses and find blind spots early and make the improvements in time. The second conclusion, and this is where we have good news to share. Not everything is bad here. So Rem just showed us that threat actors can pretty easily and quickly create massive numbers of new malware variants. And one of the questions that we kept asking ourselves during the research was, how do we defend against a campaign that looks different every time? And at first glance, we can see that traditional methods start to fall apart, right? The signature-based detections or handling hashes is almost useless. And even string-based detections like Yara rules are pretty easy to bypass. But here was the key insight. Because AI-generated malware samples might look a little bit different, and its content might be a little bit different. But it can't really hide its behavior. Because in the end of the day, if it's ransomware, it will encrypt. And if it's an info stealer, it will steal and exfiltrate. And it doesn't matter if it's written in Python or C or Rust or whatever, and it doesn't matter if it's created by a human or AI. It drops, it executes, it starts renaming files and blocking them. And if you focus on the behavior rather than the content, you might still get good detection results. When we tested these AI-generated malware samples through our behavioral rule engines, we found that almost every behavioral rule was triggered as expected. Of course, we found different angles and new angles to add coverage and to make our detection more solid. And this is, by the way, why the predictive approach I just talked about is still important. But in the bottom line, there were no samples that completely bypass our detection. And in the world of fast-changing threats that we are entering, this is something that we can rely on. And with that, I want to move to the key takeaways from this talk. So, at the start, we asked a simple but critical question. Had the barrier for entry been lowered? Could someone with no or maybe a little expertise can now create malware from scratch? And after running this research, we can say that the answer is yes. And this is something that we need to acknowledge because the bar has been lowered, which means the threat landscape is changing right now. What used to be limited only to nation-state actors or organized cyber gangs is now potentially in the hands of anyone. And that raises a lot of new challenges to the traditional models that we all use. For example, who's considered as threat actor if anyone can do that? And what happens when the number of novel malware suddenly explodes? And for this reason, the threat intelligence itself has to change. It needs to evolve from reporting on the past to actively shaping defenses for what's next. Because today, study what has happened is not enough. Of course, it's critical to uncover threat actors' activity and stop breaches. But we also need to think like attackers and test threats before they are actually used against us. This is how we can stay ahead of the curve in this fast-changing, AI-driven threat landscape. And third, even if this threat landscape can mess up attribution or make it really harder to track threat actors, we need to remember that the behavior doesn't lie. If it encrypts, if it steals, if it exfiltrates, the behavior will probably tell the truth. And in a world of fast-changing tools and almost infinite variance, what it does will always matter more than what it is. Thank you very much.